So if you're going to put together these visual elements, you have to do it within a narrative. You can't just willy-nilly throw out these visual elements. So today we're going to talk about developing good narratives. So the narrative is combined with visual science communication, generates an illustrated factual story. And these combination of good narrative and good visuals are both based on ancient forms of communication. They're supported by the human neurobiology, what's going on in our brains. And there are many successful communication examples like children's books, film, and television, where good visuals are combined with good narrative. So to emphasize this ancient form of communication, we've been telling stories starting around campfires for millennia, as well as drawing pictures. The earliest cave drawings are tens of thousands of years ago, where we started as humans pulling together stories using visual elements. And both stories and colors affect neural activity. So the neural basis for narrative is that narrative activates the brain. And interestingly, when a bunch of people are watching the same thing, it activates the same parts of the brain. So good stories activate the brain and create a groupthink. There's a neural basis for visuals as well, and you can see from this chart, these MRI brain responses are very skewed towards the red color on this color wheel. You can see some greens and blues, not nearly as stimulating in terms of the activity. So the earliest form of narrative communication, according to Randy Olson, whose assigned reading you'll get, is Gilgamesh, which is this epic poem from Mesopotamia at least 4,000 years ago. And this Gilgamesh was this king, and he kills this fellow leading to the gods, creating a death sentence, and then Gilgamesh launches into this long and perilous journey to discover the secret of eternal life. So this is 4,000 years old, these kind of stories. Another example of how ancient visual goes is it has to do with stained glass. So stained glass was developed by the Egyptians and Romans, where they started mixing together metallic oxides into glass, which is just melted sand, and then they began to use them in the medieval period, particularly to create these colored drawings. And of course, places people went to see those were churches, and became the one place in a drab life of a farmer in the Middle Ages with no books or television or radio, is to go to church and see these vivid color diagrams depicted in stained glass. And then Tiffany began made them available in residential use almost a couple hundred years ago. So children's books, so not only is it ancient and hardwired, but in our culture, we share books with children, and they look through these picture books and have this narrative, these stories, illustrated with these visuals. And it's amazing if you go back, and when you have your own kids, go back and read these books that used to be read to, and it's amazing how hardwired they are into your brain. And then film and television, where Randy spent a lot of his career, combines the narrative and the visuals effectively. So why combine narrative and visuals for science communication? For three reasons. One, you engage the audience. The stories are much more interesting than a string of facts. Compelling visuals can illustrate points. They improve retention. It's easier to remember good stories and effective visual elements. And they shorten the reading time. The audience can actually follow the storyline and view them quickly and effectively and remember them. So there's this narrative storytelling in contrast to the logical science communication model. And narrative storytelling is where you use specific cases from which generalizations can infer greater truths, versus the logical science communication where you have abstract truths valid across a specified range of situations. Narrative storytelling is very place-based and practical, logical science communication is very theoretical and not place-based. And then one of your assignments will be this and but therefore template. Randy Olson has this TED-Med talk, and I'm going to also give you a link to an hour-long discussion which details the content of this book, which I highly recommend. Houston, we have a narrative that's very well written and easy to read, and he has these 3 templates of putting together a story. One is the A, B, T, and but therefore, and that's you fill in the blanks. So this course is about this lecture is about combining narrative and visual communication, and its attempt to embed that into science communication. But we're not trained to do this, and we rarely use narrative in putting together talks or posters. Therefore, we need to learn how to do this and figure out how to embed this into our thinking. AAA is and, which is more typical in a science talk and is long and repetitive, and it's not very engaging. And then despite yet, however, is where things go off in a bunch of different directions and never wrap it together. And but therefore structures you. Narrative stories have similar essential elements. They have cause-effect relationships. They have causality. They have a timeline with past, present, future, and they involve people. They have character involved. If you get into a longer story telling, that's the classic is the hero's journey, which you have this hero, and this is if you look at Star Wars or most modern movies, go back and look at the Odyssey or the classic To Kill a Mockingbird. This is a typical journey that the hero takes, and you go and have these challenges, and you reach this revelation, and you're transformed, and then you return transformed in a different manner. And this Joseph Campbell talks about this across all society, all religions, all societies. And science and storytelling are linked, and they're not. A lot of times scientists say, "Oh, it's not about. We're not going to tell stories. That's making stuff up." But 2 great philosophers of science, Karl Popper and Peter Medawar, have these quotes that really talk about how it's that scientific discovery and creative imagination is akin to explanatory storytelling, and that you use these imaginative constructions in science to tell stories. So they're not divorced from each other. And our problem is, as scientists, we tend to show data and trends, but they don't provide a story. And we need to convert these kind of trend data into stories to be more compelling. They'll be memorable. They'll be easier to access. So there's an example of a website which we'll provide the link for, which is the Chesapeake Bay Stories. And then there's a little tagline there on the 2013, here's the story. It's not the rain, it's what the rain carries. And then you go through stormwater and examples. And I like this quote, stories are just data with a soul. So we're still using data in science. It's not that we're going to make stuff up. We're going to use factual stories, but we're going to populate these stories with this data. So I want to go on a little journey here and talk about a comparison that Randy and I put together, comparing Charles Darwin, the famous father of evolution. He was born and lived in the 19th century. He was influenced by Thomas Malthus, who wrote the essay on the principle of population, Charles Lyell, the geologist, who talked about how old the Earth was, and von Humboldt, who was a German explorer who sort of ignited his interest in going out on an extended field trip, and he made a famous 5-year trip on the voyage of the Beagle, exploring mostly South America and briefly the Galapagos. He wrote a lot of books and scientific papers, and there's another guy who did this at the same lived in the same time period. Alfred Wallace, also Englishman, also influenced by Malthus, Lyell, and Humboldt, also making extended field trips, 4 years in South America and mostly the Amazonia, and 8 years in the Malay archipelago, which is now modern-day Indonesia and Malaysia. And he was a prolific author as well. So here we have two guys, and they both influenced by the same kinds of writings, and they went off and made these observations, and they came up with this theory of natural selection. And they actually presented in a simultaneous publication of the meeting of the Linnean Society in 1858. These two papers we came out at the same time. So here's a great opportunity to test their ability to tell stories and how effective their storytelling was, because they had the same story and they shared it at the exact same time in the same journal. And in fact, it was even co-listed here on the tendency of species to form varieties, etc. So what Randy and I developed is a narrative index to test this. And so the controlled experiment was same theory, both Englishmen, similar influences, similar observations, published same time in the same journal. And they had a guy named Hooker read it. They weren't even there. The narrative index is the number of buts versus the number of ands in the text. And so we would like to do therefore, but there are alternatives to therefore, and it wasn't, and a lot of times it's inferred but not written. But and are very commonly used English words, and so there's lots of numbers of times when they're invoked. But the ratio of buts to ands is variable, and so if you get just and, you end up with AAA type boring, repetitive narrative. But putting buts in there creates tension and facilitates the resolution with a therefore. And it's a simple quantitative index, and we applied it to Darwin and Wallace. And so Wallace, on his paper that was published in the Linnean Journal of the Linnean Society, had a narrative index of 19. So basically that's 80 for every 100 times and or but were used. 19 of those were buts, and 81 were ands. Darwin was much higher narrative index, many more uses of the word but, 27 and 26 in the two submissions he had at the same time as Wallace. But these are very small sample sizes. The papers weren't very long. So we went and looked at their prolific authors. So we went and looked at their books. And so there was a 2-volume set on the Malay archipelago and another book about island life that Wallace had written. And the narrative index was consistently below 15, 11, 12, and 14. Darwin, in contrast, had a higher narrative index in his first 3 books, The Voyage of the Beagle, the Coral Reef book, and then On the Origin of Species, 17, 17, and 20. So I think that one of the reasons that Darwin is celebrated as this icon of natural selection and was buried in Westminster Abbey. Interestingly, Wallace was a pallbearer at Darwin's funeral, and there is a medal of Wallace hanging beside Darwin's crypt, next to Isaac Newton and all these other famous British celebrities. And so that's the difference. Was Darwin was telling a more effective story using a higher narrative index. Randy and I decided to look at some other examples, and we did one which was Edward Everett, a senator, was asked to give the plenary talk, essentially at the Gettysburg, at the anniversary of the Great Battle of Gettysburg, and Lincoln came along as well and gave a short speech. Everett's speech was 2 hours long, 13,000 words with a narrative index of 8. Lincoln was 2 minutes with 272 words, the famous Gettysburg Address, narrative index of 33. Everett said, "I should be glad if I could flatter myself that I came as near to the central idea of the occasion in 2 hours as you did in 2 minutes." So even Everett recognized Lincoln's effectiveness by using the ABT structure. And it is very much an ABT. So if you look at if you go through the Gettysburg Address, 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition all men are created equal. And then inferred but, the next sentence is, now we're engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are now gathered on a great battlefield of that war, blah, blah, blah. And inferred, therefore, it is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work that those who struggled here so nobly advanced, blah, blah, blah. So the government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from the earth. So Lincoln gave a 272-word ABT that resonates to this day. Randy went and looked at the Lincoln-Douglas debates, and Douglas had defeated Lincoln in the senatorial campaign, but in the presidential campaign, where they both paired again, you see that Lincoln outperformed Douglas, narrative index average of 20, and Douglas was less than 10 on average. So you can see that he was clearly elected president to go on and give the Gettysburg Address eventually. So these narrative indices seem to have something in it. We're also looking at Nobel lectures and physics lectures. We've analyzed so far 50 years of them and have a narrative index of 15 on average, with a big range. Some notable people like Schrodinger, the famous Schrodinger's cat story, and Einstein and Niels Bohr. So we don't know what the pattern is on this yet, but we're playing around with it. So when we go to tell stories, we want to make sure we have a narrative behind it. And then in this section of the developing these science visualizations, we're going to use storyboards. So storyboarding was developed by the Walt Disney Studio in the 1930s, and the first full storyboard was Three Little Pigs. Now, every film, every television show now uses storyboards, but at the time this was an innovation in the 1930s. And you can see the little drawings. They would hand draw these different snippets that you could walk through for the story. And so a storyboard is a graphical organizer to help you plan and visualize the final product. It's created in sequence from the beginning to the end. Remember, there's time is always involved in telling story. Combines visual elements. In our case, we're not going to just do drawings. We're going to use photos, maps, graphs, and tables to go along with the drawings, the diagrams. And we're going to use active titles to support those graphics. So you can say this is the scene of such and such. So that's the concept. So why are we doing a storyboard? We're doing it to help organize our product, and whether it's a poster or a newsletter or a website or a PowerPoint. It helps organize your workload. It's good for idea generation. It's a very creative process. It helps prioritize your information. It allows for organization and for flow. The storyboard process is to start with a message, an active title, choose the visuals, estimate the text word count, and then come up with the subject matter that you're going to include in your text, and then populate it. Go and find those diagrams. This is an example of a storyboard 2-page spread in a book called Shifting Sands that Jane Thomas, who helped us with the conceptual diagram section, did. So we drew this timeline spiral, and we had some photos and text, and then we kind of took it to the next step and drew it out, and then for the final version is presented there at the bottom. So you can see how you go through this process by first starting with this message, what am I trying to say, and then coming up with the visuals. So that's what we're going to try to do for this week is come up with your storyboard. Start with your narrative and but therefore, and then we'll talk about getting some active titles and populating these with the various visual elements that you've created, the photos, the graphs, the maps, and the diagrams that you've done in the first section of this course. That's it. Thanks.